David, it's such a pleasure to talk with you. I have to tell you, I've been a fan of your work since, of course, Snow Falling on Cedars. Such elegant prose and landscape, it's almost a force of its own, and character relationships that really ask the hard questions, all of which is absolutely true of your newest novel, The Final Case. There's a lot to discuss, the legal case at the heart of the novel, the relationship, I should say, between the narrator and his father, who is an aged criminal defense lawyer, and the themes surrounding privilege and wealth. And then I've asked David if after our questions and discussion and before the Q&A at the end, if he would read us a small selection from the book. So I'm going to try and keep us on track so that we have time for all these great things. Let me start with the author's note, because it's, of course, at the front of the book. It mentions a 2011 Skagit County, Washington case in which an adopted Ethiopian girl dies of hypothermia in her own backyard. A case that you attended through trial. You went on to do research both in the US and Ethiopia, and this case informs the fictionalized legal drama at the center of your novel. How did you discover this case? And what made you decide to use fiction as opposed to an essay or nonfiction to talk about the themes?
Well, this case started in May of 2011. I noticed on the news a story about a girl adopted from Ethiopia who lived about an hour and a half north of Seattle, so not far from me. She had died of hypothermia in her yard. And as the summer wore on and there was an investigation, her parents were arrested, charged with homicide by abuse. And the reason that this spoke to me is because I myself, my wife and I are adoptive parents of a girl from Ethiopia. In fact, we adopted from the same agency as this couple in Skagit County whose daughter ended up dead. And our daughter, her availability for adoption was at the same time as this girl. So it struck me that our daughter could very, very easily have ended up in that tragic situation. And I think, well, that's definitely where it started for me right there. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. And likewise, the girl in the case could have been in a different destiny. That's
Yes.
So interesting. Well, Delvin and Betsy Harvey are the Christian fundamentalists who are standing trial on the death by abuse charge of their adopted daughter, Abeba Temesgen, whom they have renamed Abigail. The narrator's father, who's an 83-year-old criminal attorney, takes this last case because, as Royal says, and this is from the book, lawyers take their cases so the law can get on with what the law is about. If you convict someone because they're abhorrent and not because they broke the law, you might as well live in a dictatorship. Betsy Harvey, however, refuses to accept any wrongdoing in her treatment and discipline of Abigail and believes the courts to be part of a greater conspiracy. Her beliefs establish God's law as the only law that she answers to, as she defines it. So, do you feel that Betsy's religious freedoms under the Constitution create a culture in our society of looking the other way when it comes to religious upbringing practices? It's a small thing mentioned in the defense trial notes.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. And so just beginning with this notion of taking on a case like this, where a defense attorney feels perhaps that the person they're going to represent is utterly reprehensible and clearly somebody who's conducted themselves in a horrible way and done something reprehensible, and yet they take the case anyway. So I grew up actually my father was a criminal defense attorney. And I grew up in a home where this notion of being innocent until proven guilty was really driven home to myself and my siblings, and also the idea that in the United States of America, everybody is entitled to a defense. And, that's a principle that I like. I'm glad I live in a country where that's the case. Um, so, so that's maybe responding to the first part of your, what you brought up. The second part has to do with the freedom of religion in this country, which is an unassailable constitutional right that, we have. At what point, though, with all of our freedoms, whether it be freedom of religion or freedom of speech or any one of our constitutionally protected freedoms, at what point do those freedoms end? Where do they have a limit? Where do they run up against other people's freedoms? There's no freedom is utterly complete. No freedom is absolute. The old cliche, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater and then just say, exercising free speech, those people trampled each other to get out of the theater. There wasn't a fire, but I felt like yelling fire. So you can't do anything to me. No, there's always a place where your rights run up against other people's rights and run up against the social good. So with the question of the free exercise of religion, where is that point? Where is that point where your free exercise of religion runs up against somebody else's right or runs up against a sort of larger social good? And we have always, in the legal system, been very, very careful to protect the freedom of religion. And I'm glad that's the case. In this particular instance, we have homicide by abuse, and we have parents who abide in a very literal way by the biblical injunction to not spare the rod when it comes to children. And they really believe that in striking their children, in beating their children, that they're doing the right thing. They're preventing their children ultimately from ending up in hell. This is the way they view it. So then we come back to the question, if somebody views things this way, should they be allowed to adopt? And that's a deep sort of constitutional question. It's the free exercise of their religion is at stake if you say no. To date, it hasn't been resolved in favor of putting the safety of adopted children first. To date, Americans continue to have the right to free exercises of religion, and everybody can adopt no matter what their religious doctrine might hold.
Well, would it be fair to say that the father, Royal, the attorney, that his ethic boils down to this idea that we take a stand for what we believe is moral through upholding the law?
I would say for this aged attorney who's at the center of this book, whose name is Royal, who's the father of the narrator, that really ultimately he makes a distinction in his inner world, in his private moral life, between legal issues and moral issues. Yes, they converge. Yes, they are one thing in many ways, but there is some area of morality that's probably broader than the law. The law is more restrictive, it's more limited, it's more specific. It's very much tied to, things that are explicit, the language of each statute really mattering. Morality is a little bit more vague, a little more ambiguous, takes more searching, and Royal makes this distinction. So when he goes to work for somebody, the question is, did they break a law? Not, are they a bad person?
Right.
And he may feel they're a bad person, but that's a separate question altogether. No matter what the circumstances are, no matter who he's working with, though, he always has the same fundamental principle in mind, which is you can always do some good. If you're there, if you're present, if you're with people, if you're working, there's always a way to bring something good into the situation. And that's really what drives him as a person and as an attorney.
Well, there's a convergence kind of in between something that Abeba, the child, writes about good and evil, and in her experience in Ethiopia, and what Royal does, that it's like the law stands apart from beliefs of good and evil. And in the way that Abeba accepts that the murderous role of the hyena but prefers to look away from what she considers evil. And so they've both sort of separated or parsed out good and evil from the law and what they believe is the common way of life. And I just thought it was interesting, and we'll touch on this a little later, that Royal's belief in the law itself is his way of defending the definition of the common good. That when we create statute, it's our collective decision that this is what we believe is right and wrong, that we're willing to code in law. And I don't want to make this a legal discussion for you. There's more to talk about. So
Sure.
I won't stick you with that. Politics and privilege. This was an interesting part of your novel. Around money and privilege as it works in US criminal law, international adoptions, and among the employees of the tea shop run by the narrator's sister, Danielle. These discussions of wealth and privilege and who has what rights and what power under these systems. Royal, the attorney for Betsy Harvey, frequently works pro bono for free for his clients, often those without resources, and frequently charged, as you said, with abhorrent crimes that no other lawyer would take on. Is this an important aspect of the story, exposing the role of wealth and privilege in negotiating a case through the court system? And is the imbalance of privilege and opportunity mirrored in the circumstances of the Ethiopian orphanage and the director's commitment to the children in her care, even though she has so little in terms of resources or rights?
Well, issues of power and privilege are so deeply embedded in human circumstances that it's unavoidably, you will find them everywhere. And international adoption is, embodies this as well as just about anything. I mean, if you stop and think about it in one way, international adoption simply means that people with an enormous amount of wealth, power, and privilege who decide that they want to adopt a child can simply do so. They can simply reach out into some other country where people don't have the same kind of power and privilege and wealth and claim a child. And I mean, if there's anything sort of quintessentially about power and privilege and wealth, it's circumstances like that. So, I mean, there's two sides to the coin with international adoption. On the one hand, while we're arguing about power and privilege and wealth and, right and wrong, and, oh, the world should be different, it shouldn't be like this. There shouldn't be people who have all of this on the one hand, but who don't have much on the other. And while we're arguing about this, literally right now at this moment, there are children in orphanages who need homes and who want homes. And we can sit around and argue about it for years, and those children will just continue to sit there. Now, some people will say, well, we need to have structural change. We need to change the way, the world works. So this isn't the case. And I don't disagree. There are inequities in the world that need to be addressed. But while we're addressing them, there are individual children who are suffering. So there's a way to kind of assimilate all this and end up at the perspective that, yes, I have wealth. Yes, I have privilege. Yes, I have power. The only thing I can do is try to use it for the good. I mean, rather than just sort of wallow in it and enjoy it and take it as my right and a pleasure, take it as a responsibility and an obligation. You've been given all these circumstances, use them for the good. And I think that, again, Royal's got that, the attorney in this case has definitely got that perspective.
My next question is sort of in the realm of how timely your novel feels right now. I mean, just in terms of the last few years in our country, the conflict between social common sense as expressed by the law and extreme personal conviction as exemplified by the Harveys. that seems to be increasing in our time. And I'm wondering if you feel the divergence is anything that we can do about, can we bring these closer together? Or is this what the Constitution protects?
Well, this is a great question. We're maybe in some way talking about the extreme polarization that we're experiencing as a country, this fragmentation, this sense that we're going in two very opposite directions at once, and that some kind of confrontation, is developing between people who see what our country ought to be in very, very different ways. In this novel, yes, you have Delvin and Betsy Harvey, who are extremely right-wing, and the worldview that they inhabit is articulated at one point at length in the diatribe offered by Betsy Harvey's mother. And that's a sort of rendition of the vision of one extreme in this country. But elsewhere in the novel, we meet other extremes. There is a young socialist, very far to the left, who has her own rant and goes on at quite some length. And there's a young man.
Shop.
Pardon me?
In the tea shop.
In the tea shop, yeah. There's also a young man who despairs at what he feels is the loss of his white privilege, that somehow being a white male has just destroyed his life. And he is at this point in this milieu and in the atmosphere in which he finds himself in our time, in our country, he feels beset by circumstances. And so at a number of junctures in this book, we see these sort of extremes of perception or these extremes of feeling about where one stands relative to other people articulated. Because I didn't want to take one side or the other, because I don't take one side or the other. I'm just trying to present human beings and all their complexity, the ways in which all kinds of human attitudes and tones and behaviors and personalities manifest and converge. It's not I don't consider it my role as a novelist to sort of somehow drive home a particular political point of view. No, I want to present human beings, in conflict with one another. I don't want to answer questions. I guess I want to ask questions and just present them so that we can think about them.
Yes, excellent. A little bit about Ethiopia. First of all, your prose is just so tight and gorgeous, and you capture these evocative, unique details that really bring the characters to life. But the role of geography and landscape in many of your books is also extraordinary. And when you went to Ethiopia, either in your own adoption process or in your research for this novel, to research Abeba's background, what did you discover there that changed your intention for the novel? Anything?
Well, so I had been to Ethiopia twice already before I went the third time to do research for this book. And actually I should maybe sort of back off a little bit from that and say, when I went to Ethiopia to do research for the book, I wasn't really sure yet that I was going to write a book. I had started, my interest in this had begun because I was an adoptive parent. And I started becoming interested because of that. And I went to the trial because of that. And as the trial proceeded, I began to think, well, maybe I'll write a book about this, but I don't know exactly what the book would be. I just know that I have a lot of feelings about this and it's staying with me, and I don't want to let go of it, in any way, emotionally or creatively. It's in me. And I went to Ethiopia sort of to nurture that and to wonder, to see where it might go. And it did definitely deepen my interest in writing about this. Why? Because in the most sort of tangible, on the ground way, unavoidably, you see the humanity of the person who died, who was the victim of this crime. You see where they came from, you see the emotional life of their family, you see the reality. It's undeniable. It's not just a name in the newspaper. It's not just this sort of two-dimensional thing in a book. It's real. And the more real it becomes, the more painful it becomes. And then the deeper your feelings become about it. And all of that finds its way onto the page.
That's very powerful. And as a reader, I definitely experienced that. I thought that was a very rich part of the novel. To detour to the epitaph that begins the novel, which is a quote from Middlemarch by George Eliot, and I'll just read it for those listening. That things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. Writing about this case definitely shines a light on the plight of the innocent victims, but also it's an homage to those who toil towards a more just world, unknown and unseen, as the narrator's father royal practices law, and the glimpse we see of the orphanage director in Ethiopia. And the selfless work ethic appears intentionally contrasted to the narrator's feelings about the foolishness of fiction, except as a telling or a retelling, as in the novel, of important truths, which to me was perhaps demonstrating fiction's ability to bear witness. What are your thoughts on the way that the book's characters strive to live meaningful lives? Whether at work, upholding the law, living a devout religious life, running a tea shop, running the orphanage. Do you feel there's meaningful work in fiction, even as your narrator has lost faith?
I mean, I think I would say thematically central to this book, at its core, it is really about this very question of how to live a meaningful life, which is a question I think we're always asking ourselves. We're always wondering, what's the purpose? Why should we do what we do? Well, I guess I have to make a living and I have to pay the bills, so I go and do this, whatever it is I do. And you can look at it that way, that my real life begins after work, or my real life is on vacation, or my real life is on the weekend, but I have to do these other things to pay the bills. That's one way to look at it. And you can say, whatever I'm doing, whatever job I have, it doesn't really, you can say to yourself, it doesn't really feel particularly meaningful to me to be doing whatever it is I'm doing. But there's always a way to bring meaning to it. And that's to tell yourself that, going back to something I said earlier, everything is an opportunity to do something good. There is never a time at which you don't have that opportunity. It doesn't matter what you're doing. And I see this every single day, to come back to the quote from Middlemarch. Everywhere you go, every single day, whether you're at the gas station, the grocery store, or wherever you are, you see people who know this. You see people who want to bring love into the world in the way that they interact with you. And it's important to them. It's one way that they get through the day, is by saying, a great meaning that I have in my life is to be good to the people that I come across, is to be kind to the people I come across. If I can do that, then there's meaning in my life. And it doesn't matter that I'm an ordinary average person, just living a quiet life, and that one day I'll rest in an unvisited tomb and nobody will remember me or think of me. Irrelevant. We're all impermanent. None of us ultimately are going to be remembered for very long. So this search for fame is just sort of ridiculous, where this idea that I should be an important person who changes the world, nobody's really important. The best thing you can do is take every moment and tell yourself that right now, in this particular moment, I have an opportunity to be good, to be kind, to be the best I can be for other living things. And that epigram to the book is about that. And in some ways, the book itself is about that.
I really felt that resonate so strongly in the character of the father. I mean, he was sort of the complete embodiment of that. It was really remarkable. The life of the narrator and his thoughts about fiction, which he has abandoned in the novel and downplays in his conversations with his colleagues and students, lifts when he talks about final lines. He cites The Great Gatsby, the very famous final line of "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." And this final line idea is also expressed in Royal's last line, "Bring me my shoes." You know, he's all about getting to work, doing what he does. And Allison, the narrator's wife, delivering the final line in the novel, "We can love people. What else is there?" So, I mean, fiction and poetry are a source of inspiration for several characters in the novel, caught as they are in very serious and discouraging circumstances. And Allison, the narrator's wife, makes frequent allusions to poetry. She quotes Kakakur to linger in the beautiful foolishness of things, but then she adds, "Let's move on." And what does Allison's comments say about beauty, art, incidental joy in daily life?
Well, to go back to the first part of your question, the narrator at the beginning has come to a position in his life where he doubts the value or meaning of what he's been doing professionally for a long time. And saying to himself, you know, I've written a lot of fiction, it's done whatever it's going to do, it's either been a good force in the world or not. You know, I'm content, got all these books behind me. I think from now on, I'll just, you know, mow the lawn and wash the windows and take care of the laundry and tinker and putter and that sort of thing. And that will be enough. You know, I'm done. That attitude that people can have at a certain age. I did what I did, and now I'm just going to relax. So this narrator at the beginning is sort of feeling that. And then he becomes intimately involved with his father's final case, becomes a part of it. And it's driven home to him what he has forgotten, which is that there's never really an end. You know, even if you stop writing, it's not the end of your potential for a meaningful life or for bringing something valuable or beneficial to others, you know, into the world. But he sort of forgotten this. He's in that position. So his story is a story of rediscovery, you know, of purpose. The events of the book bring him back, and so do the people in his life. So not just being around his father, but as you mentioned, Allison, you know, his wife, who in her gentle way, you know, tries to remind him, I guess, that his life can have this sort of value and meaning beyond what he's contemplating at the moment.
And so the final lines and the importance of that in The Great Gatsby, sort of discussing about that no matter what we're trying to do, we're always coming back up against our past. How do you juxtapose that with what Allison says about we can love people? That her idea that what else is there? That seems like a very forward energy for a final line.
Right. Well, I think there's a significant, you know, significant sort of contrast between the two. So in the last line of Gatsby, you know, the idea is there's a certain tragic quality to this idea that you don't really escape the past. So we beat on boats against the current, drawn back ceaselessly into the past. You know, no matter what we do, this past that's behind us is still determinative. And The Great Gatsby sort of ends with that sense. But we can love each other. What else is there as a end point or a final line in a novel? Well, I hope it does what I intended, which is when a person turns the last page of the book and when a reader reads the last line, my hope is that the reader will continue to live in the world of the novel for a while longer and that it will linger. They won't entirely escape it. They won't turn the last page and then just forget about it. Something emotionally and intellectually at some level will stay with them. Now, if you tie up the package too firmly, so every little thread is in place, then you don't leave room for that.
Right.
But if you don't tie it up enough and it feels like it's just floating off, then you've just frustrated people because it doesn't feel like an ending. So finding that balance point where people feel like a satisfying sense of conclusion, but also a lingering of questions and mood going forward. That's what I saw out of the final line of the book.
Well, it's a remarkable book, and to what you've just said, I've thought about it. I finished reading it about a week ago, and every day I have been making different linkages between the meaning, finding purpose, even to the level of the father, the lawyer's simple purpose in doing his job without thanks, without recognition, the meaning that has given his life, the meaning that, the character's sister Danielle running her tea shop and taking care of the people who come in and go, to the gentleness of the narrator in looking after his father as he takes on this mountain of a challenge, participating with him, doing some of the legwork for him. There's so much in this novel. I think you've accomplished your goal. I absolutely loved it, David.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you
If
did.
you wouldn't mind, would you read a short section for us?
I'd be happy to do that. And I didn't necessarily in advance, prepare or find a good section, but I sort of would like to just read I will read from the very beginning of the book. If you keep in mind that this book is called The Final Case, so it really lays out the particulars of one octogenarian attorney's final case in a very long career. And at the beginning of the book, we hear about his very first case. And there's something that gets sustained through the course of this career from the first case to the last case, because it's the same person all the way through. Okay, beginning of the book then. My father was a criminal attorney. In his office, case files filled cabinets on all four walls. A few years ago, those files got transferred into boxes, and the boxes got stacked floor to ceiling in the room where I wrote novels. Chronologically arranged and tagged both with dates and the surnames of clients, they formed a bulwark counterpointed by my windows. Outdoor light then had to run through tunnels constructed of my father's files before illuminating the pages I was working on. One morning, sitting in an uncushioned Windsor chair while outside my recessed windows, wind swiveled leaves so that their hidden sides showed, I opened a file and began to read. It was titled Wilton, Teresa. And the first thing I found there was a letter written on November 6, 1955 by a Mrs. James Lovell to the superintendent of Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington, about her sister, Teresa Wilton, who'd been a mental patient at Western State earlier that year, but had since returned to her family. Mrs. Lovell's letter offered background. Teresa had 4 children. Teresa had left her husband, Frank, many times over the years. Teresa had attempted suicide 2 years earlier. Teresa had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Teresa currently had 2 sons at home, Sean and Marcus, ages 7 and 9. She was incapable of caring for. At the moment, Mrs. Lovell said, Teresa was in the throes of mental illness and firm in her belief that Frank planned to kill her and all their children, planned even to kill their son, Kenneth, who was serving with the army in Korea. The next day, I found this in a document entitled State of Washington versus Wilton, Teresa. Teresa Wilton took a 38 caliber revolver out of Frank's suitcase, waited in a bedroom doorway as he came upstairs after breakfast, and shot him in the back. After stumbling downstairs, Frank died face down on his kitchen floor while Sean and Marcus looked on. A judge asked my father to represent Teresa Wilton. There were not yet public defenders in Seattle, which in 1955 had no freeway or skyscrapers. My father was 25 at this point, and this was his first case. I'm going to stop there. The chapter goes on to sort of summarize this first case and how this young attorney at the age of 25 conducted himself in the course of that first case. And all of that sets up the novel and acts as a kind of prologue through which we can filter our sense of meaning with regard to the final case that this novel is about.
Well, the case takes a very dramatic turn, and the writing in that part is really edge of your seat. It's thrilling, and this is part of what I find is this push-pull dynamic, in the court case, in one hand, and these really deep questions about meaning and purpose and where we are in our own moral convictions. I thought it was so interesting. I mean, Kirkus Review gave you a starred review for the book. And one of the things that they said is that Guterson tests the reader's understanding of story, truth, and where the two intersect. And I thought that was really very insightful, because an insightful comment, because you do have the narrative of the court case, which is about fact. You have the background of Abeba, which is about, experience and everything that brings her to Washington State. You have the fiction writer whose job is interpreting the outside world and creating story from it, sometimes a retelling, sometimes, an invention, but he's very much about story. And then you have the whole way in which the judicial system plays out over the course of the novel with regard to the Harveys. And do you agree with the Kirkus comment that it's really about story and fact and where they intersect?
I mean, I've seen this comment in a few places, Kirkus among them, that the novel takes an interest in this sort of convergence or intersection between fiction and reality. Mm-hmm. And it does, but I don't feel like I'm working in the genre sometimes called autofiction, mm-hmm. Or sometimes people call it metafiction, fiction that's about fiction, or autofiction, where the question of reality and fiction is sort of really up in the air, and central question, those sort of questions about reality being thematically at the heart. I would say it's a lot more pedestrian than that for me, in the sense that I'm working in the realistic mode. And I'm writing realism, and in realism, central to its potential to work, mm-hmm. to have its intended effects, is to convince the reader that it's real, to get them willingly to suspend their disbelief. So if you start out by saying, well, the narrator is a novelist, well, right away they're thinking, well, Guterson's a novelist, so maybe this is real, And if Guterson then says, well, the narrator then says, well, I've quit writing novels. Well, then maybe this isn't a novel we're reading, you see. So all of these are just those sort of craft bag of tricks that authors have to create verisimilitude and get readers to suspend disbelief. I'm not trying to do any more than that with it. I'm not
didn't think-
profoundly interested in the deep question of reality.
it didn't strike me that way, which is why I wanted to ask you that question.
Yeah,
And I expected that you knew that you would have to deflect some of that commentary, because your narrator states in the novel that he's not, about trying to make a clever retelling or, use this to mean that. And I think
despite
actually,
everything, even the author's note at the beginning where I say this is a work of
yes,
fiction, I
yes,
still have people who have responded to it by saying, I believe this is all real.
yeah.
So,
No, it's, yeah.
yeah.
I thought it was beautifully set up, because you have your author's note about where the, how this informs the novel. And then you have the your epigram, where you talk about what it is that is sort of the theme, the meaningful life. And then you talk about how that works out for those in the legal system and those who are not in the legal system, but bystanders of events in life. And it's very powerful thematically that way. It was for me as a reader. I know we're coming up on time for question and answer, right, Claire? It's about a quarter of, so I will stop asking you things and let the listeners have at it.
Okay.
Hey, well, I'd just like to encourage folks to drop your questions in the chat whenever you like. And our first one is from Susan. David, if you could have dinner with any 3 writers, living or dead, who would they be?
If I could have dinner with any 3 writers, living or dead, who would they be?
Me, choose me.
The writers that I really love to read are the ones who I know are at least 1,000 times better than I am. And there is something called genius out there in the world. When you come across it, your jaw drops. Some writers absolutely deserve, this sort of stellar reputation as giants. And those are the writers that I would love to sit down with and get to know and spend time with. And so, there are quite a few names, obviously, that fit into that category, but thinking of some writers living or who worked recently, I really respect J.M. Coetzee, who won the Nobel Prize, a South African writer now living in Australia. Whenever I read something by Coetzee, I have that feeling of being in the presence of genius. The same thing happens to me with a Spanish writer named Javier Marias. Every line, I'm wondering how he does it, and I'd love to sit down with him and figure out what that's about and how that happened. I love Jose Saramago, a Portuguese writer. I'm still a fan of Garcia Marquez all these years later. A wonderful work, genius.
Right.
So, just in general, this notion of sitting down with writers who strike me as having a kind of innate genius, those are the people I'd love to sit down with.
Then this next question is from Rita, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit because she was also curious about sort of the auto fiction elements of your book, but she was also curious about the relationship between Royal and how you thought about your dad's work. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, so as I mentioned earlier, my father was a criminal defense attorney, and I grew up in a home where these issues of justice and fairness were literally at the dinner table. And I always respected my father. He did take a lot of pro bono cases. This was before there were public defenders where somebody had to do it, even though they weren't going to get paid or not get paid very much, he would do it. To tell you the truth, he never really cared too much about money. It didn't really matter to him. He was in a firm with other attorneys who, were doing other kinds of law and making a lot of money. He didn't really care. It wasn't like he enjoyed poverty and he didn't have poverty. We weren't poor, but money wasn't what his life was about, and I respected that too. Now, during that trial in 2013, the trial in which this book is based, My father was in a decline, and by that fall, he had passed away. And so I felt emotionally distracted all summer long. It was a very long trial. I was distracted every day by what was happening, with my father. And these two things just converge in the book, this case and my father's decline and the worldview that my father had, they all sort of came together in the book.
And then this next one is from Elaine. She says, Snow Falling on Cedars has a courtroom scene as well as this current novel. How much research do you have to do when you write a courtroom scene?
Well, it was different between the two books. So taking up this one, I suppose the most sort of tangible kind of research was just literally attend the trial every day. I did miss one day, but I was there for 6 weeks straight, and I had a notebook open the whole time and took notes sort of madly the whole time. So there was that. And then there was constantly, I was pestering the defense attorneys and the prosecutor and the judge. And I was running around interviewing different people that I had found out about in the course of looking at all the documents generated by the trial. And eventually I got to the point where I really felt confident, to write about the trial because I had immersed myself in it. And I guess in a more broad sense as a novelist, I'm a big believer in immersion, and I really can't start writing till I feel that I've immersed myself so thoroughly in something that I'm not as apprehensive about getting things wrong. I'm very apprehensive about getting things wrong. I think it's disrespectful to people to get things wrong. So I always go into it with this sort of concern that I don't know what I'm talking about, and I shouldn't be writing about it if I don't. So I tend to do a lot of research. The other piece of that is I'm inherently a curious person. I mean, the research can become an end in its own right. I can forget that it's supposed to be serving a book, and I have to sort of cut myself off at a certain point and get sort of back to actually writing a book because everything is interesting to me in the end. Yeah.
Is there something you hope that readers take away from this book? A thought that you would want them to leave with it after they close it?
So what would readers take away? So just to be clear and to distinguish between different things that can mean, the takeaway. I think some people are always looking for a book to have sort of a point, and that you'll read this story and you'll think about it and you sort of wonder what the point is. But by the time you get to the end, you'll know what the point was. And that's sort of what the journey is about, is discovering the purpose behind this story, the reason the author told it, or what point the author wants to make. But I don't really look at it that way. For me, the takeaway is not so much that the author has a point to make, as that the author began with at least one question, or maybe a set of related questions, or some things that were persisting in the writer's consciousness that the writer needs to address as a human being, needs to think about. And the story is one way of thinking about it, of thinking through significant issues in human existence. And while thinking about them, you may not necessarily arrive at conclusions. You might just be exploring some significant questions that are inevitable because you're human. And you're presenting, the takeaway is that writer and reader share the exploration of hopefully mutual concerns. And so you are present as a reader as the author explores these questions. Maybe doesn't come to conclusions, but explores them. I tend to look at takeaway that in that vein.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I think we'll leave it there for tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us, and that was so wonderful. Thank you, David, and thank you, Glenda. It's lovely to see both. Everybody have a wonderful night. The final case is available at antiesbooks.com, and we hope to see you at more events soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Have a great
Good
night.
night.